Welcome to What is CoP26, brought to you by Born Free. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just a few days before the official UN climate change conference commences in Glasgow, it'd be really interesting to learn a little bit more about it, we thought. So today we're joined by Born Free's Head of Policy, Mark. Hi, Mark. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Laura. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me along today. So my name's Mark Jones. I trained as a vet at Liverpool University many years ago and worked for a number of years in fish health and disease control. And then I spent about 5 years traveling around the world and working on rescue and rehabilitation projects for wild animals in South America and then in Asia. And I worked with a lot of different types of animals, including primates, bears, birds, and reptiles. So it was a really exciting time for me. And when I got back to the UK, I did some further training in wild animal health. And I've been working in the non-government charity animal protection sector for about the last 14 years on everything from international wildlife trade to wildlife conservation and animal welfare policy. And I joined Born Free in 2014, where I'm currently head of policy.
Oh, thanks, Mark. Brilliant. We're also joined today by Abby, a youth climate activist based in the Northeast. Hi, Abby.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much to Born Free for having me here today. So yeah, as Laura said, I'm kind of a climate activist. I'm 17, so quite an activist for the young people, I guess. I'm also a member of Youth Parliament for North Tyneside, and I'll talk about that a bit later. And I guess that's where I really started getting involved. But yeah, I'm really passionate for the cause, and I hope to kind of answer some of your questions later.
Thanks, Abby. That's fantastic, and welcome. So we're going to have a few questions and answer a few questions from the chat box at the end. But in the meantime, I have a few questions. So, Mark, can you tell us a little bit more about the work of your team at Born Free? What kind of work do you get involved in?
Okay, so the role of my team, policy team at Born Free, is to try and make sure that international and national laws and policies protect the welfare of individual wild animals and the wider natural systems of which they're a critical part. I suppose so that nature can thrive and recover for the good of us all. And to do this work, we work with other organizations and individuals to try and improve international agreements that determine how we manage our relationship with wild animals. For example, those agreements under the United Nations on issues like wildlife trade, wildlife conservation and management. And we also try and make sure that countries stick to the commitments that they make under those agreements. And as well as our international work, we also work with national governments, including here in the UK, where we've been trying to ensure the government fulfills its promises to improve protections for nature and wildlife, and that we continue to justify our claim to be a nation of animal lovers by properly protecting and looking after them. And I guess I'd say our biggest job is to try and ensure that governments and policymakers recognise the importance and prioritise the welfare and protection of wild animals and nature in everything they do.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a handful, a lot of different work you do. But, you know, what Born Free is a wildlife charity. What is it about the climate change issue that Born Free is particularly interested in?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that when people think about Born Free, they think about our work with wild animals, our animal rescues, our sanctuaries, our wildlife conservation programs in parts of Africa and Asia, and our wildlife campaigning and education work. And of course, I mean, our mission is to end the exploitation and suffering of wild animals, protect wild animals' habitats and ecosystems, and inspire compassion and respect for wildlife. So they'd be absolutely right to think that. But I think the world's currently facing three really major crises that have been caused largely by people's dysfunctional or broken relationship with the natural world. So we have the climate crisis with all the problems associated with global warming and extreme weather events. We have the biodiversity crisis with 1 million species at risk of extinction and with wildlife and nature disappearing at unprecedented rates. And we have the human health crisis with the world having been almost brought to a standstill by COVID-19, as we all know, which has so sadly resulted in the deaths of almost 5 million people. It's affected the health of hundreds of millions more and disrupted pretty much everyone's lives. And what I think we're beginning to realize is that these crises are all interlinked and that you can't really approach them or find solutions to them in isolation from each other. So to give you an example, protecting and restoring nature is key if we're to limit the impacts of climate change, since nature acts as a natural buffer to climate change by absorbing the greenhouse gases that are causing global warming and providing a natural sort of carbon store. And scientists are beginning to understand through work that's been done on, for instance, great whales and elephants, just how important the role of wild animals is to maintaining healthy natural systems that can store carbon and reduce the impacts of climate change. And if you look at this the other way round, limiting global warming is also key to protecting wildlife and nature, because as the world warms up and environments change, many animals and plants find it increasingly difficult to survive and thrive in the habitats they have evolved to live in, because the conditions are changing. So protecting nature and keeping wildlife in the wild is also key to preventing future pandemics like COVID-19, since while most of the viruses that could cause future pandemics probably originate in wild animals, it's only when we disrupt and exploit those animals that we put other animals and ourselves at risk of infection. So I think it's really vital that we take our message about the importance of looking after wild animals and the systems, the natural systems of which they're an essential part, to the discussions on climate change. We need to make sure that policymakers and politicians really understand that all these crises are linked and that protecting nature is an essential part of addressing the climate crisis. And to do this, Born Free is going to host an event in Glasgow on Sunday, the 7th of October, called State of the Earth Question Time, at which a panel of experts from science, from industry, from non-government organizations like our own, and representatives of the younger generation, who, let's face it, are going to be the most affected by the climate crisis, will be invited to answer questions from an audience of around 400 people. And you should all be able to watch this debate live online. I think it'll be a really interesting session.
No, fantastic. Thank you, Mark. And I think that leads us quite well into the next question is, we've all heard that the term COP26, but what is it? Can you tell us a little bit more about COP26?
Yeah, so COP26, a lot of people will have heard the term, and it's due to start in Glasgow next week, is the 26th annual international meeting between governments that are signed up to something called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. Now that's a bit of a sort of mouthful, but basically governments all get together every year, and this is the 26th annual meeting of that convention. And at the meeting, government representatives from all over the world are going to be discussing what progress has been made up until now to tackle climate change and what they need to do going forward. So the convention, the UNFCCC, began back in 1992 at a big international meeting in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil that's become known as the Earth Summit. And at that meeting, it was recognized that countries had to work together to tackle and adapt to climate change, primarily by reducing greenhouse gas emissions such as carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, with developed countries like the UK taking the lead. And today, governments of, I think it's 197 countries have signed up as what are called parties to the convention, which means most of the countries across the world are now part of this global agreement. And the convention has its headquarters in the German city of Bonn. So it's a really important meeting that's coming up.
Okay, well, thank you. And how does this fit with the Paris Agreement? Because that's another term that potentially people will have heard of around the climate discussion.
That's right. Well, since 1992, various efforts have been made by the convention to secure legally binding commitments from governments on the actions they need to take to tackle climate change. And the most recent of those legally binding commitments is the so-called Paris Agreement. Now, this came about because of serious concerns that efforts had not yet been good enough and that we weren't making enough progress. So at their meeting in Paris in 2015, governments agreed to aim to try and limit the increase in global temperature to below 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, countries were given quite a lot of freedom and flexibility to develop their own plans, which are called nationally determined contributions, for how they would go about achieving this. But they're asked to report their progress back to the convention at the annual meetings. Now, the success of the Paris Agreement depends on really on all countries signing up and implementing the measures they set out for achieving it. Sadly, the United States withdrew from the agreement under Donald Trump's presidency, but signed up again in February of this year. Now, the US is one of the 3 biggest greenhouse gas emitters in the world, along with China and the EU. So it's really important that they're now back on board again. And that again makes CoP26, which is coming up so soon, really, really important.
Fantastic. And what is it that they need to or are aiming to achieve in the COP26 time, within the time of that meeting?
I think COP26 is a chance to remind everyone that it's now more important than ever for countries to take action to tackle climate change before it's too late. So the main goals of COP26 include ensuring the world reaches what's called net zero emissions, which means that our greenhouse gas and other emissions will no longer be making things any worse, in effect, by the middle of this century, and keeping global warming to within that 1.5 degree limit that I mentioned earlier, through measures like ending the use of coal, stopping deforestation, speeding up the switch to electric vehicles, and encouraging investment in renewable energy, such as solar energy. And most people have probably heard of these kinds of commitments and processes. The goals also include adapting to protect local communities and natural habitats from the effect of climate change by, for example, protecting and restoring nature and biodiversity, building defenses and warning systems and really strong infrastructure and farming practices to avoid the loss of homes, livelihoods, and even lives in many cases. COP26 is also aiming to raise more money to help countries deliver on these goals. So developed countries like the UK must really deliver on their promise to find at least, I think the figure was 100 billion in climate finance per year to help developing countries that perhaps can't afford so easily to put in some of the measures that are needed. COP26 is also aiming to get a commitment to work together to deliver on the Paris Agreement and speed up action to tackle the climate crisis through collaboration between governments, businesses, and civil society. And civil society includes all of us, organizations like Born Free. So like all international negotiations, there's an awful lot to do, but all of our futures could depend on getting this right.
Wow. So it's a really big meeting with some really potentially significant outputs. What is it that we can expect to sort of see out of that? Many of the decisions will be really technical. Will we hear about them? What are we going to see as outputs from this?
I think we've all got to remember that we all have a responsibility to take action to help reduce the impacts of climate change. This isn't something that can be solved by governments alone. Everybody has to play their part. And the individual choices that we make about the way we live, what we buy, what we eat, how we travel, and so forth are all critical. Because although, you might think, well, what difference does what I do make? And on an individual level, you may have a point. But if we collectively make changes to our lives that are going to reduce the impacts that we have on the environment, then we can have a real impact. So a lot of the messages and decisions that emerge from COP26 will be designed to help inform and educate the wider public. However, as you say, some of the decisions will be very technical. And part of, I think, Born Free's job and the job of other civil society organizations is to help make sure that all the decisions are made public and that they're explained in a way that everyone can understand. And only then really can governments expect the wider public, all of us, to buy into the decisions they're making and play our part in implementing them. The public also has a really important role to play in calling on our government and all governments to implement the actions we need to take to tackle the problem. And I think young people are especially important in this regard, because it's younger generations that are going to feel the most effects from climate change. And in this respect, their views, your views, everybody who's listening here are really vital, and it's really important that they're heard.
No, well, fantastic. And what do you think is the most significant thing we can do as a nation to try and tackle the problem?
There are many things we can do here in the UK as a developed nation. We hear a lot about phasing out fossil fuels, investing in renewable energy, buying and using electric vehicles, and of course, these aims continue to be really important. But I think we also need to re-examine the way we make, distribute, and consume products, including the food we eat. Many of our current farming practices are very damaging to our climate, our wildlife, and the wider environment. And we need to think about our role as consumers in ensuring we make responsible choices. So, there's going to be big changes needed to our lives, and we've all got to buy into that and accept it. Our main efforts as a wildlife charity will be focused on highlighting the critical role of healthy wildlife and natural habitats in tackling the climate crisis. As I said earlier, we need to recognize that while we might be a developed nation, we're one of the world's most nature depleted countries on earth. So we want our government to commit to investing seriously in nature, both here in the UK and overseas, to ensure we protect what we have and rewild vast areas of the UK for nature and wildlife, and incorporate green areas into our towns and cities in a really meaningful way to help reduce climate change and to improve all of our lives now and in the future.
Oh, thank you, Mark. And it sounds like it's something that we all need to feed into, and that actually feeds in quite nicely to a question I had for Abby. What specifically do you think young people can do to help tackle climate change?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to kind of reiterate Mark's point about, like, it might be cliche, but it definitely works that, like, every little helps. So you as a young person might not see what you do. So if you change your plastic bottles to reusable plastic bottles, you might not see that change kind of by yourself, and you say, oh well, I'm making such a bit, I'm trying to change my kind of behaviors and things. But what's the point when you see like big businesses polluting and big countries not kind of giving, like, not caring as much as you do? And kind of with that, yes, it's frustrating, but you can do so much as a young person. So I saw in the chat box before that Parliament, I think it's Parliament Hill, who has their own climate action group. That is exactly what young people should be doing. You find like-minded people, and even if you don't find like-minded people, try and convince people your side why you think fighting for climate change is so important. Explain to them the facts, the figures, try and get on their side, and then you can work together as a like-minded group, form an activism group, or work with your school council. Try and get your school council to get on board. Try and get teachers on board as well in your school. And if you are a member of staff in a school who is interested in this, and you know the students who talk about it in schools and classes and things, start your own climate group. Find the students who are passionate about it, and try and come together. Try and see what you can do in school to change kind of different things. So if it's that your school cafe still sells plastic water bottles, try and get them to not sell them anymore. Try and switch to a different provider. Things like that you can do as an eco group. So yeah, finding or starting your own eco groups within schools or communities. The other thing is kind of just talking and having conversations within your own friend group, having conversations within classes, having conversations kind of within your family as well, because I bet a lot of you in school learn a lot about climate change. You learn a lot within, whether that is in science, or whether that is in geography, or whether that is being on webinars like this. But I bet your parents don't know as much about climate change, or whether that's in the news. I guess the news skews it a bit, but you need to tell them how you feel about it. If you want to change something in your house, maybe say to your mum and dad, oh, I don't really want to, or I don't tell your mum and dad, oh, I don't want to eat meat this week. Can we try and do like a meat-free week? Can we try? Because I learned in school that consuming meat is bad for the environment. So it's things like that. What you're learning in school, try and translate it back to home. And then finding community programs to get involved with, that's the same thing. So trying to get into your local youth council, seeing what things your community is having on. So seeing if you want to try and organise like a community litter pick or something. But yeah, have conversations about it, start your own eco groups, and just be loud, whether that's in person talking to people being loud, or being loud on social media. Young people, we're all so tech savvy that if you kind of try and get your voice heard on social media, the politicians have to listen, the decision makers have to listen, big companies have to listen. So yeah, be loud.
Fantastic. I think that's really good advice. Thank you, Abby. And you're obviously really passionate about it. So why is climate activism important to you?
I think climate activism is important to me and so many young people because, like what Mark said, it is our world. And yes, generations above can kind of pollute what they want, make what they want, produce as much plastic as they want, but they're not going to be the ones who are at the forefront, and they're not going to be the ones who have to experience all these kind of effects and all these damaging consequences. We as young people, we're going to be tomorrow's leaders. So why do we have to sit back and do nothing now? That's not how it works. We have to kind of be at the forefront of our own change, and we have to, if we want something changed, then don't wait for it. Don't wait until our generation goes into parliament, into politics, into policy making. Do it now. I think that's why personally it's so important to me, because I don't want to be sitting around waiting for all decision makers in parliament doing nothing. Is why I'm so passionate about it. It's just very frustrating as a young person seeing your voice being heard, but then not being listened to. So policymakers, politicians, they say, yes, we listen to young people, we appreciate and we are so enthusiastic about young people with climate change, but then nothing happens. So don't be disheartened if you're listening. If you're listening on this webinar, don't be disheartened. Try and get your voice heard and try and be your own activism.
So you're still sort of 17. How long have you been involved with it? When did you start getting involved with climate activism?
I'm not gonna lie, I don't think I've been as big of an activism or as long of an activist as other people have. I think I probably started getting involved with it when I joined my local youth council, which must have been about year 7, year 8, year 9. So it's still quite like about 4 or 5 years, but I think in those 4 or 5 years I've done so much that I'm proud of. But how I really started with that is when I joined the local youth council, I joined our environment group, and what we did is we tried to do a refill project. So what this was getting other small businesses, local businesses, cafes around North Tyneside to jump in on our scheme, which was if they had a sticker in their window, in the shop window, then passers-by knew, oh, I can refill my water bottle in that establishment. So then it reduces single-use plastic, and it allowed people to fill up their water bottles without then having to buy another plastic water bottle if they're out and about. That was good for obviously the environment because there was less single-use plastic, but it was good for the people passing by, but also good for the small businesses as well because they got more traction. But yeah, so it was a win-win all around as well.
Yeah, well, fantastic. That sounds like a brilliant initiative. What sort of other activities have you been involved with during your activism?
I think the biggest thing that I'm proud of is myself and the environment group got North Tyneside, got North Tyneside's mayor, got their council to announce a climate emergency. I think it was a couple of years ago now, but we were at the forefront of them announcing the climate emergency. So that was amazing because we got to talk to decision makers, we got to talk to policymakers. And yes, I talked about policymakers not listening to young people, but I think that is one of the times I can hand on my heart say that policymakers actually listen to young people. And it was just really kind of rewarding seeing that all of our hard work, striking and talking to people and getting our voice heard actually meant something, and it led to something actual, like tangible. And then with that climate emergency, then they then had to kind of have legislation in place and things. So that was really amazing. Some of the other things I've done with Board Free as well is we did a kind of art competition to try and get people kind of talking about animal extinction and making art out of it. So if it's something, so you kind of learn about different animals becoming extinct, and instead of just kind of talking about it, instead of just kind of like looking online at Google Images and things, you kind of actually made art with it, and then they all went to the exhibition. So that was amazing. That was an amazing time as well. But also with that, we got to meet so many different people. So whether that was on a webinar with Born Free, or whether that is when you talk to other people about climate activism, you meet so many different people through this common interest of wanting to help your community, wanting to kind of help climate change, wanting to kind of fight against climate change. You meet so many people, you meet like-minded people, and it's kind of amazing that this kind of massive community of young people and activists come together with this common goal. So yeah, I think that's some of the things that I've done with climate activism.
Oh, fantastic. That's a really quite impressive list. You should be really proud of that. One thing you sort of have roughly touched on is that it can be quite overwhelming. It can feel like you're not being heard. And, you know, we know these terms now, eco-anxiety, climate anxiety. What advice do you have for young people here today, or young people in general that might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the task ahead of us?
Yeah. Yes, eco-anxiety and climate anxiety is such big things now that if you'd asked someone 10 years ago, no one would have known what that was. But I think it's kind of more obvious in young people. When young people, we see that we try and do so much ourselves, and we try and change so much. We try and change our behaviors, try and change the behaviors of those around us. And then you see big polluters, the richest people, different countries, just not caring at all, or not doing as much. People who can afford to do said things as well. And that is really frustrating a lot of the time. But the advice I have with that is turn your frustration, turn your anger into something positive, whether that is trying to convince people, or trying to do more things, or trying to talk to politicians, or trying to be loud on social media, to kind of convert your anger, convert all that energy into good energy, into positive energy, and try and do other things. I think that's my best advice for people who are frustrated: convert it into good energy.
I think that is really good advice, and I think that's something that we should all try and follow. Yeah, converting that into good energy. And we have created a one-pager with some of the information from this, and it does actually have a link on there to a whole host of resources for people who might be struggling with climate anxiety. And I know Charlie is going to be posting that in the chat box in a second. So we've now got to the point where we would really like to invite questions from the chat box. So anyone who has anything they would like to ask Abby or Mark, please do just send it in. I'm sure I can find a couple of other questions to ask while you're having a think about that. So perhaps Mark, if I could ask you, just, you know, is there still time to tackle climate change?
Well, there's a big question. Just before I get into that, just say how inspiring it is to hear Abby, you know, speak about the work that you're doing and the passion that you have. And I think, you know, the point she makes about the younger generation, I'm 60 this year, so I'm old. I'm, you know, the younger generation are science savvy, you're tech savvy, and you're kind of unencumbered by all the vested interests that you accumulate as you get older. So I think, you know, young people with the kind of enthusiasm and passion and just knowledge that Abby and I'm sure so many of your peers have, it's really important that you use that to try and educate the older generation. You mentioned sort of going back to your parents, going back to your teachers, going back to other people in your networks, and explaining to them what this climate anxiety is all about, why it's happening, and why this is so important to the younger generation. Because, you know, my generation's messed all this up, and we have to take some responsibility for that. But in terms of, is there still time to tackle the problem? Well, as I say, an awful lot of damage has already been done, and we can't reverse everything that's been done. We can't do that. We can't go back to pre-industrial climate. It's not going to happen. So the goals aren't really about reversing all the existing damage, but rather limiting its impact on the climate going forward. I think there is still time to limit the damage if we act cohesively and collectively and right away. You know, this isn't something that we can keep talking about forever. We have to really get on and do it. But we really can't afford to let things get any worse. And at the moment, most countries are failing to meet the targets, even the targets that they agreed to meet under the Paris Agreement. So things are currently set to get worse, and we really, really need to turn that around.
No. Wow. Yes. So we had a question in from, I believe from the Climate Action Group. Where is the incentive to switch to cleaner energy for developed countries such as Australia, whose economy relies on fossil fuel revenue? It's a very good question.
Yes. To some extent, we have to create these incentives. I think, when I was talking about Abby and younger people getting involved, I said you're sort of unencumbered by the vested interests that we all accumulate over time. And the problem is that there's an awful lot of vested interests in some of the types of industries. Australia, it's principally coal, all the fossil fuel industries that we've built up and relied on for so many years to produce energy, to heat our homes, to do all the things that we want to do, to be able to travel around in our cars and so on. And there's an awful lot of people out there who work in those industries, who run those industries, an awful lot of politicians who support those industries, and that's how they've got into politics and so forth. So there's a lot of sort of what we call vested interest, people who are whose own personal circumstances and their own personal way of life or wealth or whatever it is relies on those industries. And a lot of those people are very influential people, often business people or whatever, or in some cases politicians as well. And they will try and have a big influence over this issue and limit the speed and degree of change, perhaps. I think what we've got to try and do is to create the incentives for that change, to make it clear that we can't just not take action on fossil fuels because the fossil fuel industries generate lots of money. We've got to recognize that we have to move away because the costs in not doing so are going to be so great going forward, and we have to convince our policymakers that they have to factor those costs, the costs of greater global warming, the costs of losing all our biodiversity and all the ecosystem services, the services that biodiversity provides us and so on. We have to factor those costs into the equation, and when you look at it that way and you look at the benefits of moving towards much greener economies, and the number of jobs that can create. It's not just a case of saying, okay, we're going to have to lay off lots of people because we're closing down fossil fuel industries. But what we have to do is to provide incentives for retraining of those folks so that they can move into the green energy sector and so on, and really have a really positive impact as we go forward. So I think it's up to us, up to policymakers, to create those incentives to enable those big changes, and they are big changes. It's not going to be easy, but that are going to facilitate those big changes and help us to really make the changes we need as we go forward.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a really good point. Sort of make the incentives, let's not wait for them to be there. So we've had a couple of other really interesting questions, and I'd like to start with one I'm hoping Abby can potentially feed into or think about. It's quite an interesting one. Sort of, student has written, I heard that one Google search took up as much energy as a light bulb being on for 3 minutes. So in a school setting, how can we make changes to this when people rely so heavily on the internet now? What ideas can we give people to try and get around that?
This is such a hard question, because I think as a society we've kind of, just like Mark was saying, we rely on these things that in the past we didn't know how bad they were, like how badly they contributed to the environment. But now that we do, we want to make the change, but we've kind of, I guess, addicted to it. I think with that is, I know it defeats the object at first, but it's researching what else is out there. So yes, that extra Google search to find out what other search engines there are. So for example, I could give you one if that's what you want. Another search engine you could use is Ecosia, ECOSIA, and I'll type into the chat box as well. And what they do is they're a search engine that every search, they then plant a tree, which is amazing. But it's things like that there is alternatives out there that you have to kind of research and find out more about. So for example, search engines, that's one. But then, for example, in school setting, paper is a really bad contributor in school. I can tell you myself that when you try and convince students to recycle more or to not use as much paper. It doesn't go down very well because we've relied on paper, on convenience and just printing it. But try and get your school to switch to recycled paper. Or what we've done in our climate club is that we now recycle paper, but not just recycle paper in the recycling bin. We actually make like new paper with old paper. So over the past few sessions, all the students have been bringing in like last year's GCSE notes, homework, everything, and it's quite just therapeutic and fun to just cut them up. And like what you do is like you make a mold and then you kind of make new paper out of it. So it's things like that where you're turning old into new, or where you're trying to look for alternatives. So whether that is not using a plastic toothbrush anymore, but using a bamboo toothbrush, things like that. There's alternatives out there. You just have to look for them. And there's so much stuff out there as well. So whether that is talking to other people, someone else might know an amazing hack or an amazing alternative that you didn't know about, then you could switch with your Ecosia one now. But yeah, things like that, finding alternatives, I think, with that.
Yeah, oh, that's fantastic, and I'm glad you had that example there as well. I think that's really helpful to know what they do. There's another question actually that I think you might be able to also help with. Sort of, how would you go about persuading a climate change denier? That's a big question.
It is a big question. I think that at the moment now, it's not the climate deniers that are the problem, it's the climate talkers who just talk about climate change but get nothing done. I think they're the problem. But with climate deniers, okay, if they're not listening to the facts and figures now, about 5 years on the line when we've been talking about it for ages, then there's probably no use in convincing them why climate change is just a bad thing. Try and look at it from their point of view. So saying, oh, switching to green energy will actually cost you less in the long run because it's just cheaper, or switching to a reusable bottle is cheaper in the long run because you don't have to keep buying a single-use plastic. It's things like that where you have to see the benefits to them. So whether that is you're trying to convince school to change to LED lights, or to switch to green energy, things like that, they won't see it straight away. Try convincing your school bursar to implement LED lights and get rid of all the old lights. It's going to be a tough task, but when you look at it from their point of view, try and see, okay, so actually if you switch to LED lights, your kind of benefits, you'll start seeing your benefits however many years down the line. And then they'll have to kind of say, oh, well, if we're saving money in the long run, then it's kind of irrational to not switch. So yeah, things like that. There's no point in trying to convince them. Try and see it from their point of view and try and explain to them how going green, how making small changes in their life, in their lifestyle, behavior change will benefit them.
That's some really important advice. Thank you, Abby. And I think that's probably come to the end of the number of questions we have. But Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think Abby's made some really, really important points there. I think it's I was really taken when you said turning anxiety or anger into something positive. And I think that's a really important message to take away. Something positive can be writing to your MP, using social media, joining the clubs, making the noise. I think you said be loud. And I think that's really, really important. But also don't underestimate the importance and the impact that the individual choices and actions that you can make as an individual person will have. It's a matter of making sure that we do that collectively, so that the individual choices that people make are amplified millions and millions and millions of times over. And then that's going to have a real tangible impact on climate going forward.
And I think a really good example of that, just to leave everyone with this, is that maybe 5-10 years ago, using a reusable or a single-use plastic bottle would not necessarily have been something that everybody thought about. Now, I would be really surprised if you see many people at all with single-use plastic bottles. Everybody has reusable metal bottles, plastic bottles, whatever they're made out of. They are for multiple use. And that is a big change that's been made by small actions over the last sort of 10 years. So, it does happen. Don't give up. And thank you, everyone. I'm aware that I want to get give you some chance to go back to your classes and have a little bit more of a discussion internally about this. And I really appreciate you joining us today. For future school events, please do visit our website. We do have a number of school events available. And we also have free teaching resources, online sessions for schools, magazines, and all different ways to get involved with our work. So do just have a look in the chat box. Charlie's going to put a few links in there, but equally you can just email us at education@bornfree.org.uk. A huge thank you to everyone who's joined us today, and the really thoughtful questions that everyone has posed, and a huge thank you from myself and to Mark and Abby. Have a great day, everybody.